wanted to very, very briefly say just a couple of things about why I'm sitting at this table. And I'm actually a faculty member here at Emory. I'm a neuroscientist and also an advocate for other animals. I'm also the executive director of the Kimmela Center for Animal Advocacy, which is a new nonprofit organization bringing science and animal advocacy together. So for the past 20 years or so, I've studied brains, intelligence, and self-awareness in dolphins and whales. And I've studied the brains of many different species, including orcas, and this is all from individuals who died naturally. I've also studied cognition and intelligence in dolphins and whales. In 2001, I published a paper with Diana Reese demonstrating that bottlenose dolphins recognize themselves in mirrors. And this study showed that dolphins and humans have a very similar sense of self. It's not identical, but there's some overlap there. But soon after that study, I realized that the captivity was not a good place for these animals. They're intelligent, they're self-aware, and in fact, the animals that I worked with on that study died soon after that. So I stopped conducting research on captive dolphins and whales. The dolphins in the mirror study were bottlenose, but they were dolphins and so are orcas. And because they are dolphins, they share a level of intelligence, their psychology, and social complexity that makes it impossible for them to thrive in captivity. Orcas have brains over 2.5 times the size you would expect for their body size. Now, I have not been the only scientist that has sat back in awe by the sheer grandeur of the neuroanatomy of the orca brain. It is impressive. It is a brain that dwarfs our own, and it is a brain that in many ways is more elaborated than our own. These brains are not only oversized, but they exhibit features that make it absolutely clear that these are highly cognitively and emotionally complex beings. And again, this complexity makes it impossible for their needs to be met in captivity. The stresses of captivity on these large, complex beings are evidenced in their poor health, their shorter lives, and abnormal behavior in captivity. And this leads us to the topic at hand. This wonderful, wonderful substantive book, Death at SeaWorld, by David Kirby. And the tragedy of captivity for both humans and orcas. I think that David's book tells us that captivity does not work for orcas, and it does not work for people, and it never will. So I am very pleased to have with us tonight David Kirby, the author of Death at SeaWorld, and Dr. Naomi Rose, who is with Humane Society International, and for 2 decades has been a wonderful scientist advocate for dolphins and whales. I'm going to now turn the floor over to David, and then Naomi will speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marino. Thank you, everyone. And I just want to point out that there's quite a number of cameras here, and we're live streaming this as well, and I think people are going to be twittering in questions and everything. And for the benefit of the people not here, we have a packed house, and I'm just thrilled to see so many people here. Thank you. It's really great. I'm glad to see interest in this subject. I'm glad to see interest in people like Naomi and Dr. Marino, or Lori, I guess I should say. These are not only people I consider friends, and they're not only amazing scientists, they're characters in the book, Death at SeaWorld. Naomi is the lead character, really. It tells her story, and through her eyes, we really get to learn about killer whales in the wild. And then later on in the book, through the eyes of trainers and former trainers, we get to contrast with the lives of killer whales in captivity. And I thought it was so important to deeply describe the science behind their intelligence, behind their social behavior. And these two women were just instrumental. I was telling Lloyd, I got to interview her on San Juan Island as the orcas were basically splashing offshore. And we just sat there with a tape recorder on a beautiful summer day, and she told me all about the brain anatomy of killer whales, and I was just so captivated. And then to go out and see them and see, kind of put it all together, was amazing. So I'm so happy to be here. There are other characters from my book, at least one that I just wanted to mention. He's hugely central to the whole book, and he doesn't even appear until the epilogue. So try to figure out how I pulled that one off. But he is the main attorney for OSHA. You may know, if you haven't read the book, SeaWorld sued the federal government after the federal government hit them with the highest level violation in the death of the trainer Don Branchow in Orlando. And SeaWorld decided to sue the government to overturn the violation. And the end of the book ends with that trial. And I consider myself an amateur legal scholar, and I know a little bit about the law. And John was really good. and he won for the most part. The violation was reduced from willful to serious. But the most important thing is all of the abatements that the judge ordered are still in place. This legal fight continues, but I'm just really happy that John came. And just as a coincidence, John lives in Atlanta, and I have my lead character from my latest book. I also have my lead character from my first book here, and that's Lynn Redwood. My first book was about autism and the possible role of thimerosal, the mercury-containing preservative, which is a known neurotoxin injected into newborn babies that might produce neurological symptoms that we call autism. When I first came to Atlanta, I met Lynn. It was 10 years ago, I think. She picked me up at the airport. Her son could barely speak, and she just dropped him off at college. So I like to think that the people I profile know what they're doing. And she turned her son's autism around. So if anybody says autism is incurable, go have a word not only with Lynn, but with her fabulous husband, Tommy, who's a surgeon here in Atlanta and worked just as hard as Lynn did on their son. So this is an interesting reunion of sorts. I wrote this book because of Larry King, actually. My second book, which I feel like I should have somebody here for my second book, was about factory farming. And you may remember 2 summers ago when there was that giant egg recall, about 500 million eggs were contaminated with salmonella. I was writing about that subject, so I got invited to go speak on Larry King that night. And we were in the second segment. The first segment was the OSHA violation. OSHA had just slapped SeaWorld with this violation in Don Branchow's death. And I remember that day. That had happened in February of 2010. I'm a writer. I work at home. I sometimes keep CNN or MSNBC on in the background or whatever. And I remember very clearly that split screen day with that whale up in the corner by himself. And I remember feeling terrible for the trainer and her family and friends. And I remember feeling nothing for the whale. It just didn't even occur to me, even then, the captivity might have something to do with the fact that this woman was dead. That's how basically ignorant I was. So I went on Larry King, and I'm watching, and this woman, Linda Simons, who was a former high-level executive at SeaWorld, had stepped forward to basically accuse the company of all kinds of malfeasance and stonewalling and basically obstruction of justice in the investigation of Don Branchow. And my job was I had to scrape it off the floor of the green room watching this. The allegations were so serious, and what she was saying was so shocking. And SeaWorld, to me, was such a squeaky, shiny, happy family place that it just seemed incongruous. I didn't expect this. And then, of course, there was this bloody shouting match between Rick O'Barry and Thad Lassenek, a former SeaWorld executive. And that's when I knew this was not only an interesting subject, it was a very emotional one. So I called my agent the next day. I said, this is a great story. But I'm an investigative journalist. I mostly have written about corporate malfeasance, and that's where I was going with this. You know, this image of SeaWorld being contradicted by what this whistleblower was coming forward to saying with these shocking allegations. Well, I quickly learned that whether trainers should be in the water with killer whales or not is not really the question at hand. I mean, it's huge for the federal government. But for me, the real question became, should killer whales be in this environment in the first place? So my subject matter, it didn't change, it grew. From the death of Don Branchow, the investigation, the allegations of cover-up, to the dangers of whales in captivity, to what are whales doing in captivity in the first place? Because as I said, I gave it no thought. I grew up in Southern California. I went to SeaWorld as a kid. I saw the original Shamu, which if you're good at math, you can figure out I'm not young. This is quite a while ago. So again, I was neutral. I was completely agnostic about captivity. I knew a little bit about swim with dolphin programs, that they probably weren't really great for the animals. So I very quickly, I write my books as narrative nonfiction, so to tell a good story, you need good characters to tell it for you. So it reads like a novel, and almost instantly, if you Google killer whales, the name Naomi Rose will come up definitely on the first page. She's one of the leading experts in the world, and she happens to work for the Humane Society and dedicate her life and her work to not only killer whales in captivity, but all kinds of marine mammals in captivity. And I found out she had been in British Columbia for 5 summers studying killer whales in the wild. So I immediately knew who my through character was going to be. And then I sort of got contacted by these trainers who used to work at SeaWorld Orlando. And they were just starting to come out and speak out against the practice and against the dangers in the way that trainers are trained and the safety that they receive and the way the animals are treated. So I started seeing a book coming together, and it was really a wonderful experience. So again, I wanted to learn about killer whales in the wild, and I wanted readers to. I also write a lot about science, and I wanted to make the reader work a little bit. You have to learn, because if you don't learn, you can't appreciate. If you don't realize how magnificent life in the wild is for these animals, you cannot really appreciate how awful it really must be for them in a tank. So I went to San Juan Island a couple of times. I went with Naomi up to Johnstone Strait in northern Vancouver Island, where she did 5 years of field research. And I read her dissertation, which was outstanding. And I spent time with people like Ken Balcom, who studies whales, and Paul Spong. If you know the community up there, these are some of the top researchers in their field. And what I learned was just so wonderful, and what I saw was so wonderful. And I learned about their family bonds, and I'm sure Naomi will be talking about this, and I learned about their intelligence. And I learned that the males stay with their mothers for life. They're one of the few mammals in the world who do that, and how does that work? And Naomi's original research produced the answer. And I'll let her describe it, but it's absolutely fascinating. And I saw how these whales, and I learned how they care for each other. And I learned that they recognize themselves in mirrors because they're dolphins. And I learned that they live a really long time. I saw a 100-year-old female that they call Granny in the southern resident community jumping out of the water, estimated to be 100 years old. I saw females that were 60, 70 years old. I saw males that were 40, 50 years old with their perfectly erect dorsal fins. I saw them rolling around in the kelp and spy hopping and breaching and calling out to each other. And in San Juan Island, the beauty of it is you can just pull over on the side of the road or go to the state park for free. One of them now charges $10 for parking, but there's a docent there, a naturalist who will sit there, and the whales come by every day in the summer on the west side of San Juan, and children and parents are there watching this and learning, and it's an amazing experience. And one day I was out with Michael Mountain and a few other people. We were in a place called Eagle Point, and the entire J pod, there's up in that part of the Pacific, you have what are called resident whales. These are the ones that stay together for life in large pods. They're mostly fish eating, and they're extremely social. Then you have the transient whales, which travel together in much smaller pods. They're the ones who eat mammals. They're the ones who kick the seals up in the air, and are very aggressive. You have a third type called offshores, which are very rarely seen. They spend most of their time out in the ocean. But the residents are the ones that are most studied, most known, most identified. And they're the ones that have the closest relationship with people. Ken Balcom told me that every summer or spring, when the whales come back, there's always a few newborns. And the mothers go right to his boat. They know the sound of his engine. They bring their babies to his boat because they know he's interested. And I think they're probably saying, hey, this guy's okay. This boat's okay. These people aren't going to hurt you. He claims they even turn the whales upside down and he's able to sex them. Now, whether they do that specifically, I don't know. But it tells you there's somebody there. There's somebody home. And I experienced it out on Eagle Point one day where this J-pod, there must have been 30 whales in this bay. And the other great thing about watching from a cliff is the boats have to stay 200 yards away. So when the whales come in close to shore, you get a great show. And we were watching them, and all of a sudden these 3 whales came swimming right in front of us, and we could see the salmon scattering out of the way, and then they dove. We sat and we waited. Well, they're going to come up, they'll probably come up, 50 yards down like they do. They never came back up. And then we looked out over the bay, gone. Everybody, gone. So Granny probably gave some kind of call that we'll never decipher. Every single whale in that pod said, we're leaving now, we're going that way. And they were gone. And that just blew me away, to be honest. To have that kind of coordination and communication and cohesion. And you've probably seen the whales hunting in the Antarctic, where they make a line up and they'll rush an ice floe with a seal on it. And they'll create a wave and the seal will slide into the water. There's usually another whale there to catch it. They often let that seal get back up and they do it again and again because they want to wear out the prey and they're actually kind of tenderizing the meat a little bit. But this is what they do. And the amount of coordination that takes, you can imagine. So you have these lifelong bonds, you have this uncanny intelligence, you have this amazing communication, and you have this longevity. And I was so fascinated. And then I went to SeaWorld. And then I really started looking into what life is like for these animals at SeaWorld. And these former trainers paint a completely different picture. And the science paints a completely different picture. When we look at longevity, instead of living 50, 60, 70 years, these animals are living 4, 5, 10, maybe 20 years. Tilikum is pushing 30. He's an outlier. Most killer whales in captivity die, I would say, in their teens or 20s. And if you look at the science, if you look at annual survival rate and annual mortality rate, so at the end of the year, what percentage of that herd or that pod is still alive, up in the Pacific Northwest in the resident pods, the mortality rate at SeaWorld or in captivity is 2.5 times the annual mortality rate in the wild. And for me, that alone, that was it. That was like, okay, you know what? I'm a journalist. I always tell or try to tell both sides of a story. I'm writing a book, so I get to have a point of view. But my point of view is that captivity is wrong. And I cannot come to any other conclusion now knowing what I know. For me to go out and say, well, I'm a journalist, and so I don't have an opinion, and I can't really say, and yes, it's good because education happens, so I think on balance it's fine. I would be lying, and I'm not going to do that. And that's just the longevity issue, which I do think is the most important. But I think, their deaths can be quite brutal as well as young, and I describe them. And the way that they die, not only the rate at which these animals die, the way that they die. One died when a gate crashed his skull. One died in a fight with another female when she broke a blood vessel in her rostrum and bled to death in front of a crowd, spurting blood up through her blowhole. 2 whales have died from mosquito-borne tropical diseases because they spend so much time resting at the surface in hot, muggy weather, Texas and Orlando. One died of West Nile and one died of St. Louis encephalitis. They don't get these in Alaska and British Columbia. in Iceland. Whales don't die of tropical mosquito-borne diseases. Some have died in childbirth. Some have died just from horrible other tumors and digestive issues and things like that. And the fact that more don't die is kind of a miracle. SeaWorld works really, really hard just to keep these animals alive. And I think that's what I wrote a chapter called Breakfast at SeaWorld, where the trainers described how they would stuff the gills of the fish with antibiotics and antacids and vitamins, and how frozen fish, when you freeze fish and thaw it out, it not only loses nutrition, it loses fresh water. And for cetaceans, whales, and dolphins, who are mammals and need fresh water, their only source is fish or their prey. And so these animals become dehydrated. And you may, in the very, very famous video of Dawn Brancheau right before she died, she's throwing giant chunks of gelatin into Tilikum's mouth. He gets 80 pounds a day just to try to replace some of the fresh water he's losing out on. Tilikum was on injections. He was on a whole range of drugs the day that he killed Dawn Brancheau. He wasn't feeling good. So these animals do get sick. It's a huge task to try to keep them alive. I've heard talk that they get antidepressants. I don't know if I've ever been able to confirm that. And then there are issues like the dental work that they have to have done, because they break their teeth on the metal gates. And once the teeth gets broken, SeaWorld, they have trained the animals to put up with this. They take a handheld drill that you buy at Home Depot, and they drill the pulp out until the blood spurts out, and then they know they've reached the nerve, and they hollow out the tooth. And then for the rest of that animal's life, they have to wash out its hollow teeth, the ones that have been hollowed out, 3 times a day to prevent bacteria from getting in there and from the animal dying of sepsis. Then, of course, there's the dorsal fin collapse. All the males at SeaWorld, all the adults, have completely flopped over dorsal fins, which is very rare in the wild. And the only known cases that I'm familiar with were whales that were in distress. 2 whales that were in the Valdez, Exxon Valdez spill, who later died. And I think another whale that had been hit by a boat. So to me, that's a sign of ill health. It's also a sign of spending too much at the surface. That fin is made of cartilage. It's 6 feet tall. It's huge.
No cartilage.
Not cartilage.
Disconnective tissue.
Disconnective tissue. It's
Don't
like
expect
cartilage.
that.
No. I want to be accurate. Forgive me. And it flops over. So if you are this really smart animal and you live this remarkable life that has evolved after 5 million years, and you have this giant brain, and you're in love with your family, and you spend your whole life by your mother's side, and you're suddenly snatched out of the water and taken away and shipped off. And I tell the story of Tilikum, and I told it from his point of view, and I've taken a little heat from that here and there, but I don't mind. I think it was really important to tell that chapter from his point of view. And then he gets shipped off to sea land of the Pacific, and then one day a trainer slips and her foot goes in the water. He's never seen that before. He's been put in a tank with 2 older females. Of course, females dominate Orca society, and they beat the crap out of him all the time. And he sees this trainer's foot, and he grabs it, and he pulls her in, and he doesn't want to let go. And it takes 2 hours to get her body out of the water. Now, Sealand doesn't want him, doesn't want the other 2 whales. Who's going to take them? SeaWorld decides they are. So Tilikum and one of the females come to Orlando. A few years later, a transient a trespasser, climbs over the fence, stays late, goes into Shamu Stadium, decides to strip down to his shorts and go for a swim. Of all the pools he could have chosen, he chose Tilikum's pool. Tilikum messed with him before he died. There were pre-mortem injuries and post-mortem injuries, including, and I don't usually talk about this, but it's actually kind of interesting and grotesque, but I think it's important. Tilikum ripped his shorts open, opened his scrotum, and left one of his testicles on the bottom of the pool floor. Now, if that's not a message, I don't know what is. But it seems to me that Tilikum was trying to tell somebody something. And yet, he was still at SeaWorld, and then, of course, Dawn Brancheau died, a far more brutal death than either of the first 2 people had. And it was only later that we found out that a 4th person had died just 2 months before Dawn died at Laurel Parque in Spain, and it was a SeaWorld whale that killed him, and it was a SeaWorld trainer who was running the practice session, and it was SeaWorld safety protocol in use. And yet, right after that trainer died in Spain, there was a news blackout, nobody knew about it, SeaWorld went right back to water work. And so people were in the water with the whales, and nobody ever got in the water with Tilikum, but the senior trainers were allowed to get on a shallow shelf, a ledge. And that's where Dawn Bradshaw was on February 10th after this little Dine with Shamu lunchtime show. She was having what's called a relationship session with him. She was inches away from him in about 10 inches of water, and he grabbed her. And he pulled her in, and he rammed her, and he dismembered her, and he killed her. And it was awful. And now, when I think about that, I still feel horrible for Dawn and her family. How could you not? But I'm not saying I understand why Tilikum did this, but I am saying the stress of captivity on these animals must do something to their mental health and to their state of being. And so just add it up. The longevity issues, the mental health issues, the separation from family, the aggression, the poor health, the short longevity, which I guess I mentioned, and then the danger to people around these whales. Well, when the judge made his ruling, he told SeaWorld not only stay away from Tilikum at all costs, but you need to stay away from the other whales. So not just don't do water work with them, where they get in the water and they leap from them and everything. You can't even be in close proximity. You need a distance and you need a physical barrier. Well, SeaWorld to this day, right now, the trainers are hugging and kissing when the whales come up on the slide out area. There's no barrier, there's no distance. They're basically saying, you know what, to the judge. And there will be some kind of reckoning here. I mean, this is going to come to a head, and the government will eventually intervene. SeaWorld, meanwhile, is filing an appeal in the Federal Court of Appeals to try to overturn this judge's ruling. They've lost every battle they've tried on this issue. So finally, just what has happened is a tragedy. 4 people have been killed, many more have been injured in the name of entertainment. None of them were killed researching whales. They were not killed gathering science. They were not killed in the name of knowledge or education or advancing humanity's relationship with marine creatures. They were killed in shows, except for the transit. And we have to remember that. I mean, this is entertainment. The company is called SeaWorld Parks and Entertainment. I think Lori and Naomi can speak to the lack or the poor quality of education and research that comes out of SeaWorld, particularly when it comes to SeaWorld, to killer whales, their biggest draw. So I hope I've explained why, even as a journalist, I'm comfortable sitting here saying I am personally opposed to captivity for killer whale after researching it, speaking with the experts, speaking to people who used to work there, speaking with government officials, weighing the evidence. I just can't come to any other conclusion. It's inappropriate, and it's probably immoral, and it's probably time to start to phase it out. Nobody's saying close the doors tomorrow. You know, a lot of people's jobs depend on these whales, but I think it served its purpose, and I think society is fine. You can't know what I know about killer whales and think it's okay, is I guess the bottom line. So thank you.
He's keeping time with my watch. Well, anyway, I'm Naomi Rose, and as David put it, I'm a character in his book, which is a little odd. I'm a real person. And I made the decision a few years ago, I've been doing this now for 20 years, so I made the decision 20 years ago to leave academia and move into advocacy. And when I took the job at the Humane Society of the United States, which is where I started, I now work for Humane Society International, I thought, oh, I'll try this for a couple of years and see how I like it. And it was 20 years ago. And it just turned out that it was a good fit for me. John Black may laugh when I say this, but I actually think I would have made a pretty good lawyer. I like to argue. I like to present logical arguments and challenge others to, defend themselves when faced with those logical arguments. And aside from the fact that I truly love these animals, and I had 5 amazing years in the field with them, and I've been working on their welfare and on their protection for the last 20 years, and I still get to see them both in the wild and in captivity, the real reason why I've put so much effort into this is because it offends me. It's just so illogical. Everybody is saying it's okay, it's good for education, it's good for conservation, the whales are fine, when it's so blatantly not true. And I don't like it, this whole the emperor is not wearing any clothes, issue here. I mean, we're all just sitting here like, we being the public, just sort of sitting there, taking that in as if, sure, what he's wearing is lovely, when in fact he's buck naked, and these whales are not doing well. They are not behaving naturally. The education is false, and David describes it very well in the book. What you get from SeaWorld is not true. It's incorrect. It's inaccurate. So as an academic, as a scientist, that offends me. So there's just so many things about the public display of these animals that offended me. And so when I was asked to take on this campaign, when I joined the Humane Society, it was very easy for me to just put aside my objectivity. As David put it, he's a journalist and he's supposed to show both sides. Well, I'm a scientist and I'm supposed to remain objective. It was very easy for me to put that aside and say, you know what? There's nothing to be objective about here. This is wrong. And I've spent the last 20 years making that argument, and as the blurb for the book puts, I was a voice in the wilderness. Not quite. I mean, I had a lot of good colleagues, good friends, a lot of people in the communities I am associated with, like the scientific community, actually agree with us on this. They just are concerned, nervous, timid about saying it out loud. But those sorts of quiet support, that kind of quiet support is actually very morale boosting when you're the one on the front line sort of taking all the blows. If you do read the book, which of course I hope everybody here does, buy it, read it. There's a URL link to the April 2010 congressional hearing, which was another opportunity to sort of expose the fact that the emperor is wearing no clothes. The OSHA hearing was one of those, and this congressional hearing was one of those moments. And if you watch that on C-SPAN, it's really amazing what the SeaWorld representative who was there, tries to say to these congressional representatives. And again, it's just obviously they've been getting away with it for 40 years. So I think they're a little bit in shock since all of this started in February of 2010 at how fewer and fewer people are buying it. And that's what I think the book is really all about, is to show people that you don't have to buy this. You don't have to buy the ticket. You don't have to buy the arguments. You don't have to buy it. It's false. And for a long time, I was a voice in the wilderness. I was all alone, and in the scientific community anyway. And then in the last few years, more and more people have been speaking up. Lori is speaking up. There's a few other people in the scientific community who's speaking up. And the NGOs got more coordinated. We've been working really hard on coordination. And then, this tragedy, Don Brancher was killed, and for some reason, and I still don't understand it, and I've been doing this for so long and I don't get it, it resonated. It made a difference. We'd had a few semi-pivotal, almost pivotal moments that didn't quite get there. This one, I think, was either the tipping point or was the beginning of the tipping point. And why, I don't know. 2 people had died before her, and in fact 3 people had died before her, and we didn't even know about the 3rd one. And now suddenly it made a difference. I still don't know why, and I'm not going to question it, but it happened. And so for the first time in 18 years at the time it occurred, I felt hopeful. And 2 years later, I'm still hopeful. Things have changed. The playing field is changed. If most of you are from Atlanta, I'm assuming, and so you know that there's a proposal to import 18 beluga whales to the Georgia Aquarium. These are wild-caught animals. Let me tell you something. If this new energized community has anything to say about it, that's not happening. And I'm, just personally very determined to try to stop it. It is a very regressive action. They haven't imported deliberately wild-caught animals for public display into the United States for a U.S. facility in 20 years. The last attempt to import these animals happened the first year I got the job. And I'd like to think it was like one of the first campaigns I was involved with, and that was one of the ones I won, or we won as a community. And it's not happening. It's just not happening. So if you want to come to Silver Spring and have your voice be heard, please do. I think this is something we're going to win in the court of public opinion, not necessarily in the regulatory arena or in the courts. But we'll try, if it comes to that, to win it in the courts. But I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. I'm hoping that the weight of public pressure forces the Georgia Aquarium to get a clue. Anyway, as far as the book is concerned, I think one of the reasons we have more hope about this sort of action is because of Death at SeaWorld, because of the coherence of David's book. It is all in one place now, and it is really readable. So anybody who's intimidated by the 440 pages, seriously, don't be. It's a very, very fast read.
It got very good reviews.
It got very good reviews. But not just for the content, but for the readability. I mean, it moves. You know, you're going to finish this book. Some people that I know have finished it in one sitting. So it literally is the kind of book you can't put down. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in it. I was taken with the way he wrote it myself. I was just finding myself on page 320 before I knew it.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind when you stare at the thickness of the tome. And thank you all for coming, because I really think it's people who, the people here in this room right now who are making a difference for what I've been fighting for 20 years. Thank you. We thought we would open up to questions. We've got some folks online, so there are going to be some questions coming from Becky here, who is actually taking questions from people on the live stream, but also, of course, please feel free to ask any questions you would like.
I've just got a few comments that people have made. I think that you guys should hear. First off, they want to make sure there's an applause button. Can't wait to get this book. Please mention that the SeaWorld dolphins, I don't know if this is true or not, but you may know. Please mention that the SeaWorld dolphins and pilot whales come from Taiji, where over 100 were slaughtered today.
Let me answer that question. Okay. Historically, that is true. A number of the animals that used to be on display at SeaWorld came from the Taiji dolphin slaughters. How many people have watched The Cove? If you haven't, I do recommend it. It's not just an important movie. It's a good movie. I mean, I just thought it was really well done. Historically, it is true that a lot of their animals came from that source, but they have not come from Taiji or Futo or any of the other locations where dry fisheries used to occur since 1993. If you heard me earlier, I mentioned that they have not imported any deliberately wild-caught animals for a U.S. facility since 1993. The last attempt in 1993 was for the Indianapolis Zoo and Marine World Africa USA, who wanted to import false killer whales from Japan. Their permit required them to use a humane catching method, if there is such a thing. Apparently the government agrees there is, but it is seine netting. They caught those animals in the only manner in which Japan conducts captures, which is the dry fishery. When we, the NGO community, outed them for that, the government finally had to bite the bullet and rescind a permit, which they very rarely do, because they violated their permit conditions. They did not rule on the humaneness of the capture method in 1993, and as far as I know, they never have. But nobody has attempted to import any animals from Taiji since then, because it was clearly not going to fly on the humane level alone. But just so you know, not since 1993 have any animals come into the U.S. from Taiji. Now, up until very recently, there were still animals alive from those pre-1993 captures. But as you might not be surprised to hear, I believe the last one died last year.
Can I just add to that? I happen to have a blog going up early tomorrow morning at the takepart.org, participant media, and it's about Taiji. And what I think SeaWorld's role in all this is, it's pretty interesting. They don't get their animals. I don't think any U.S. facility gets animals from the drives anymore. And in fact, they have issued written condemnations of the practice, but it stops there. It's lip service. They won't actually take action against the drive. They won't do anything to try to stop it. And they refuse to condemn those marine parks that do get animals from the drives because they say, well, we used to do that too. So if we were to say this is wrong, it would be disingenuous. And in fact, SeaWorld is arguing that what happens is they drive in all these whales and dolphins. Most of them are slaughtered. Some are selected for shipment to marine parks, usually the youngest and cutest ones. So SeaWorld says it's a salvage operation. We're actually there, or they're actually there saving these animals. But as Lori and Naomi pointed out, because they're able to sell these animals for tens of thousands of dollars, that actually finances the practice. And if it was left on its own, whale meat is not very valuable anymore because it's filled with mercury and people really don't want to eat it very much. So SeaWorld says, well, we're not going to condemn the people who still get their animals from this practice because we used to do it. But SeaWorld wants to be a leader in saving the oceans. And it just seems to me, if SeaWorld put their foot down and said, stop doing this, maybe the drive would actually stop with or without this salvage operation going on.
SeaWorld is a model for so many facilities around the world that want to be like them and want to be as rich and famous as them. And SeaWorld knows this, and yet they've not stepped up to the plate.
Yes.
Question, Becky? This book, this current book, it came out July 17th, so it's been out for a while. And I've had a lot of great reviews, as I mentioned, the Wall Street Journal, New Scientist, Christian Science Monitor. And I did quite a bit of media. I continue to. I also released a video that was released via FOIA showing an attack in San Diego in 2006. When that got released, I was actually one of the few people to go on CBS This Morning and Good Morning America on the same day. That hardly ever happens unless you're the president. And that was very cool. And I did all the major networks and CNN, et cetera, et cetera. And that video got over 5 million views on YouTube. Now things have settled down, but I'm still on tour and the book is still selling. And it is being shopped around right now in Hollywood, I can say. I can't say anything beyond that because I don't know. We just started, but there is some interest out there in possibly doing something. So we'll see. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Someone had a question about the connection between Waza and the Japanese group Jaza, and they wanted to know how all that is intertwined and the connections and with all that.
Mm-hmm. Well, similar to what David said, the facilities here won't condemn any specific facility that still acquires their animals from the drives. And so the Japanese Association of Zoos and Aquariums, JAZA or JAZA, still allows membership of facilities that acquire from the drives. And the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, of which JAZA is a member, so JAZA is a sub-member of WAZA. WAZA does not condone the acquisition of animals taken in an inhumane manner, which they have concluded that the dry fishery is inhumane. They've actually one of those entities that's made a condemning statement about the drives. So we said, okay, you don't approve of the drives as an acquisition method. One of your members, JAZA, has members that are acquiring animals from the drive. What do you do? How do you sanction your members when that's the case? Apparently, there isn't any sanction. There's no consequence to violating the standards of your professional association. So they're all still members and nobody's talking about ousting them or anything. So, what's the point of getting this kind of accreditation if it doesn't mean anything? So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, I think there was a question back
question
here.
about what you referred to earlier, your PhD.
Mhm.
Males staying with
They're mums?
yes.
Mummies, boys, yeah?
You referred to there being
Oh, mechanisms?
that was a unique behavior.
Oh, why did they do it?
Yes.
My thought, and this is actually still just a hypothesis, which there are some ways to test it, and I'm hoping someday somebody decides to do it, but I'm pretty sure it's right because it's the only thing that makes sense to me. when you have that kind of social structure evolve, there has to be some stabilizing evolutionary force to keep it in place, or else it'll, just sort of randomly fade away, or basically why I think it happened was historically there was some advantage to being social, to group foraging, to cooperation, and when you have a social system like that, the females have their offspring. They might have 2 or 3 or 4 all at the same time, so, ranging in age from newborn to 10 to 12 or so. If you keep your sons with you, you have a built-in babysitter. And we've actually measured that. That's why I came up with the idea, because they will, in fact, babysit their siblings. They're not just hanging around, tagging along with mom. They have a job. And so she will leave her newer offspring or younger offspring with her oldest son, anywhere from, so about 10 to 12 onward. When they hit puberty, they become appropriate babysitters, basically. And she'll leave them with him, and he'll just sort of watch over them. And she'll go off and she'll forage, or she'll rest, or she'll just socialize with some other females. So that's what she gets out of it, because let's just face it, males are disruptive, right? They got lots of testosterone. They got to work it off. They are more aggressive. They are more rambunctious. Any mother of a son versus a daughter will know that's true. And so they are actually a pain to have around, especially when you have more than one son. So what's the advantage to her to tolerate that? Well, he's a built-in babysitter. So what does he get out of it? Okay, because it has to be stabilizing both ways. Both parties have to get something out of it, or at least one party has to have a neutral. It has to be neutral for them. So I was like, well, what does the male get out of it? Well, females are very social. For whatever reason, and this is one of the things that happens in captivity that is so unnatural it should offend you again, just like it offended me when I first heard about it. They do not mate within the matriline. All of those sons hanging out with their moms, they do not mate with their mother. They do not mate with their sisters. They do not even mate with their aunts or their nieces. First cousins, just like in human societies, yeah, maybe, but not within the immediate matriline. They've done the genetic work. They don't do it. Why? Who knows? They don't think about it necessarily, but it's taboo. It's a behavioral mechanism. They know who their sisters are. They know who their mother is. They've got long memories. They're very smart, and they don't mate with them.
Except at SeaWorld.
And that's what has happened at SeaWorld. A son mated with his mother, and it should offend you. It's just horrible. It's as horrible as in human society when you hear about that kind of incest. Right? So what does he get out of it? Well, if he can't mate with his mother, and he can't mate with his sister, and he can't mate with his aunt, well, he's got to mate with somebody, right? And he's hanging out with his mother all the time, so how's he going to meet girls? Well, she introduces him to girls. She's very social. She likes hanging out with other females who aren't related to her friends. And then, hey, he's got immediate entree to that female because his mom knows her. And then he'll go off for anywhere from a day to 2 weeks. They're not like completely attached at the hip all the time, but very close to that. But for a few weeks a year, he's busy. And these are females that his mother, just through her own natural associations, is introducing him to. And again, I don't think it's like, hi, this is my very eligible son. I just think it's something that happens because he hangs around with his mom. So they both get something out of it. It's very stable. It works for them. There's no incest. There's no inbreeding as a result of it. So it's stable. And it works.
And I think I just wanted to add also to the evolutionary level of explanation is that obviously this is not how the orcas are experiencing it.
Right. They don't know.
Phenomenologically, they're not saying, well, I'm going to get this out of it and that out of it.
Any more than you do when you think about why you live the way you do.
Right. I mean, we're evolutionarily evolved to love our children, but you don't experience it like that. You really experience it as just the raw emotion of love. And so it's really important to remember that even with the orcas, any animals, that even though there's an evolutionary explanation for their behavior, the level that they're living at is the psychological, emotional level. So the sons are not hanging out with their moms for any genetic or evolutionary reason or ultimate reason. They're hanging out with their moms because they love them.
Yeah.
And it's very, very important to remember that for other animals, they experience life on the same plane that we experience it.
They mourn when an animal dies. One of the stories I told once in a book chapter I wrote for Mark Beckoff, who is a wonderful researcher with wolves, and he's very interested in the mind of animals and in the emotional lives of animals. Two of the males I studied, so they were part of my study group, had one of the oldest females was their mother in our group, in our population, in the northern resident population. And she finally died. She was probably about 65 when she died. Unusually, we were there when it happened. Normally, a female or a male just disappears, and we know they're dead because they never show up anywhere else. We know every individual in the population, so a disappearance is a death. It's very rare that you get that in natural field studies. So normally they don't come back the next season, and they're gone. Well, we actually found her beached on a shale beach, on one of the islands, and so we brought her in and we did a necropsy and all of that. Well, her sons mourned her. They swam around in circles around the island that we found her on for days, probably looking for her. When they finally realized she was actually gone, they disappeared themselves, and we were very concerned that they were gone, because another thing that happens is when they don't have their mothers anymore, these males who live with their mothers for their whole lives often disappear within a year. They die. You could say it's of a broken heart. You could say they don't have status. You can come up with all kinds of explanations for it, but they don't function well without their mothers. And so they often die. But if they have other family members, a sister that they can literally move in with, or a brother, in this case there were two of them, they form their own little matriline. They're gone now, both of them. They were probably about between 35 and 50 when they died. But they lived together as a pair for the next 3 years, I believe it was, without their mother. So, again, as Lori said, these animals have interior lives. The way they're experiencing it is the same way you experience your life. They have friends. They have family. They don't get that in captivity. And one of the most telling stories, one of the most moving stories that David tells is when they took Kalina away.
There's a couple of deaths and separations and situations between mother and calf that are I can only now talk about it without starting to break down crying. It's that powerful and moving. Kalina was the original baby Shamu. She was the first captive killer whale to be successfully bred in captivity, and about 4 years of age, they took her away from her mother, Katina, who's sort of the queen of Orca Society in Orlando. And Carol Ray, who's one of the ex-trainers who used to work at SeaWorld, was there that night, and they were preparing these animals for weeks for this separation. That's how hard it was just to get them to be separate from each other. And they finally took Kalina away, and Katina just went into the corner by herself and issued, mournful cries and shrieks. And this actually went on for a couple of weeks. And at night, you could hear her cries going on. There's this other story about Gudrun, who was an Icelandic whale, and she was forced to breed first with a transient whale named Kanduk, and her offspring, Taima, was the first ever transient Icelandic hybrid whale in the history of the world. Taima was quite neurotic. She died shortly after Tilikum killed Don Branchow. Then Gudrun was mated with Tilikum and had another calf. That calf turned out to be physically disabled and mentally retarded. Its name was Nayar, and it required round-the-clock care to keep this whale alive. Well, that whale probably, again, this was, help me out here. Well, it was another hybrid mix, and probably that animal would never have been born anyway in the wild, but if it had been, probably would have died. So the fact that SeaWorld kept it alive, out of, I believe, love for this animal and caring and compassion, they were actually kind of violating the brutal laws of nature. And then Gudrun had a third calf, And by this time, Gudrun, because she was one of the few females with a completely erect dorsal fin, SeaWorld loved to use her in their photo with Shamu session. Well, to get a photo with Shamu, you got to bring Shamu out of the water. So for long periods of time, Gudrun would be brought into the slide-out area while she was pregnant. And there's some belief that it was just too hard on the fetus. And the fetus died. It was a stillbirth when Gudrun gave birth. And they had to mechanically wench the fetus out of Gudrun, and she hemorrhaged. And she bled profusely. She also went off into a corner by herself. She knew her calf was dead. She was probably mourning her calf. And 3 days later, she got up the energy, this is the hard part, she swam over to Nayar, her calf that she had actually rejected. She actually tried to kill Nayar several times and drown her. And she put her rostrum through the gate and nuzzled Nayar. And then she died shortly after that. So to me, that was reproachment, that was sorrow, something.
And you just have to understand, SeaWorld, without very much concern, separates mothers and calves all the time for husbandry reasons, for logistical husbandry reasons. These animals that, form these lifelong family bonds, and they don't take it into account. It's really quite remarkable. And that's being nice.
And I just, go on YouTube, and you'll see there's videos of whales acting in the most bizarre, outlandish, abnormal ways. Hitting their head against the glass, leaping repeatedly onto the hard concrete over and over and over again. And it reminds me of the polar bear in the Central Park Zoo. You may have heard about him. I lived in New York about 10 years ago. This polar bear, all he would do was swim in circles. And you see that in autistic children. You see this repetitive, self-injurious behavior. It's acting out. It's saying something's wrong. I'm in pain. I'm in sorrow. I'm bored to tears. It's not normal.
All right, we've got a lot of questions. A couple of people are asking if you're aware of a Lolita at the Miami Sea Aquarium.
We're very aware of Lolita.
aware.
And let me just tell the folks online right now, we're aware of everything. You can't shock us.
They're asking about several different alone.
Right, several different alone
Well,
orcas.
Yes, solitary orcas, yeah. There are several. Lolita at Miami Sea Aquarium is the last one in the United States. Shuka was at Discovery Kingdom in Vallejo, California, but an activist in that area just took her cause up and said, this is ridiculous, you've got to find a companion for her. And they got Discovery Kingdom, obviously, I think they were actually nervous about what might happen if people really started to focus on Shuka. So they sent her to SeaWorld, and that's not necessarily great, but it's better than it was because she was all alone. She didn't even have another dolphin to keep her company. So she was totally solitary. So Shuka's now at SeaWorld. Lolita's still alone. She has a couple dolphins with her, but that's it. Shamenka's in Argentina, same thing, couple of dolphins with him, and that's it. And we're never quite sure what's going on in Japan. There are several orcas there, and they're a little less forthcoming with that sort of daily information, but we have a few people who keep an eye on that, and so far the last solitary orca there died not too long ago. Morgan was solitary in the Netherlands. She's been sent to Loro Parque in the Canary Islands. That's where all the SeaWorld whales were. The young SeaWorld whales that were disruptive, they were sent to Loro Parque. One of those whales was the one who killed Alexis Martinez just before Don Branchow was killed. So Morgan is there now. So they've got this incredibly dysfunctional captive bred group. One female Kahana has had 2 calves within 2 years, and she's rejected them both. She has no idea how to be a mother, but they keep breeding her. And now Morgan, this wild whale, this wild-caught whale who was rescued from the Wadden Sea in the Netherlands, has been sent to this dysfunctional captive bred group, and she, as David put it so eloquently, is having the crap kicked out of her by these whales. She has no clue how to behave around them. And this is all SeaWorld doing this because those are their whales, they own them, they're responsible for them even though they're on loan to Loro Parque.
And it's all about breeding. SeaWorld wants to open new parks in China, and they've always wanted to open a park in Dubai. that went by the wayside. I hear rumors they may be resurrecting that, but they're scouting sites in China right now, and they need whales to stock those pools.
One last person did mention Kiska.
In Canada?
Yes, sorry,
Yeah.
I did forget, and
No,
I shouldn't,
they're
because I'm actually going to be there. I'm actually going to be there on Monday. Kiska is the last living orca at Marineland of Ontario. Marineland used to have as many as I think 5 or 6 at one point, but they've all fallen by the wayside. They've all died. Kiska's the last one. She was actually with Ikaika, which is another SeaWorld whale. In 2006, they sent him up there so that they could breed. But he was too young at the time, and by the time he actually reached the age where he might have reproduced with her, SeaWorld got sold to Blackstone from being owned by Anheuser-Busch, and it was August Busch that made that deal, and so they went to get Ikaika back. And they had to sue to get Ikaika away from Marineland. And now Kiska is all alone. And she's right next door to 40 beluga whales. It's a sort of an enclosure with 2 sides to it. She's all on one side all by herself, and then there's 40 beluga whales on the other side. That situation's really untenable. I don't know what's going to happen there, but I'm going up on Monday specifically to look at the cetaceans there to try to see if we can inspire the Ontario provincial government to do something. It's out of control. The man who owns that place is out of control. Can we just
sorry.
Okay, if SeaWorld opens places in China, will they be able to import then from the wild?
Oh
They're
yeah,
not
in
coming.
for
Okay.
China. Yeah. There's no laws preventing
That's
it
a
in China.
great question.
Yeah, it
It
is.
didn't occur to me.
And then they'll launder them there, and they'll eventually bring captive-born
here.
animals into the United States. So.
There's all kinds of loopholes in these
See, that's right.
regulations. You could drive a truck through them.
That's what we're worried about
And
with the belugas.
These
Absolutely, there's
animals,
no laws preventing
they're
it.
worth at least $1.5 million, at least the breeding males, at least a piece. So it's a big.
It's probably
business.
more than that now. I think it's
Now
more
it's
like
probably
4 to
more.
5 million.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Other questions?
Yes, in the back.
I was wondering if Lori could talk specifically about the beluga whales at the Georgia Aquarium, as well as the dolphins at the Georgia Aquarium, and talk a little bit about for the local people, since there's so much government and corporate support at that particular facility here, and everybody comes to town, and goes to the aquarium.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about, from a scientific standpoint, the living conditions at the Georgia Aquarium, even though it's touted as being one of the biggest and the best in the world, and how do you cut through all of that PR to get the public to understand what's really going on there?
Yeah, Jill, then thank you for that question. From a scientific point of view, the fact of the matter is that the belugas don't belong there, the bottlenose dolphins don't belong there. Cetaceans, by nature, don't belong in captivity. They cannot thrive. Now, the fact that Georgia Aquarium touts that it has the most water, biggest tanks, and has absolutely nothing to do with, no relevance at all to the welfare of the animals. In fact, when you look at the tanks that the animals are in, particularly the belugas, it's tiny. And so the ways that we are hoping to break through this, because as you said, there's so much corporate support behind the Georgia Aquarium. And the AJC does a really good job of advertising for them by not providing both sides of the issue. So all this powerful stuff is behind it, but I really think the long game, and Naomi and I were talking about this, is the fact that if you get people to realize what's going on, if you get them to say, I had no idea, and they don't buy a ticket, that's the bottom line. I mean, the bottom line is how many people go through that ticket booth every day. And so it's really the public that has to decide whether they want this in their society or not. And so it is so important to get to people, to get them to understand what these animals are going through and suffering in captivity.
One of the items on your chairs is a set of talking points about this beluga import. as I said earlier, it's really key to stop this. We can't allow these animals into this country. The trade in live cetaceans all around the world is one of the most active in wildlife trade. Unlike a lot of other species that are held in captivity, there's still very few facilities that have successful captive breeding programs, and so cetaceans are still very frequently caught from the wild. Most of the belugas that are in China are are wild caught, and they're coming from this same operation that Georgia is patronizing. And so, if you look at the mortality rate of these animals in China, if you look at the methods they use in this operation in Russia, if you look at the sustainability of the numbers that they're removing versus all the other potential sources of mortality out there from fisheries entanglement or ship strikes or hunting, there's nothing sustainable about this, and there's nothing humane about it. So the question is, what is the Georgia Aquarium doing, buying from this source? Particularly when there's 40 beluga whales up in Ontario that need rescuing. So I think that's something you can tell people and say, the Georgia Aquarium is not living up to its hype. I mean, they're buying from a very questionable source. They're not rescuing animals that need rescuing. It's unconscionable, really.
I just want to echo something Lori said. If you go on like Goodreads.com or Amazon, and the reader reviews of my book, which mean the most to me, by the way, than anything, apart from, I couldn't put it down, which I love reading, the most common phrase is, "I had no idea." I mean, I've read that over and over and over in the readers' comments. And I had no idea. It could have been the subtitle of my book, Death at SeaWorld. I had no effing idea. Because I didn't. And I think most people don't, because you're certainly not going to get it from the media, mostly, and you're not going to get it at SeaWorld or at the aquarium.
Yeah.
When you go to see the Shamu show, you don't learn about longevity. They tell you the fins fall over because every animal's different and they all have their own idiosyncrasies. So I guess people can be forgiven for not having no idea, because where would you get an idea unless you actually looked into it? And so once people do get an idea, they change.
And this is what the captivity industry is so afraid of. Afraid that their control over the public is going to be taken away through real education and real information. They're actually afraid of that because they know once that happens, they're done for.
I thought one of the most interesting things from my perspective, given how, I've been one of the voices in the wilderness for all these years, about the OSHA hearing was the fact that these folks who weren't there for the whales, they were there for the employees, and they had no axe to grind when it came to animal rights or animal welfare or anything like that. And they're listening to a very concerted and, rational effort on the part of the employer to explain what happened and why, they shouldn't have been issued this citation. And they didn't buy it. Because it's really, again, it's illogical. It makes no sense. It doesn't fly when you listen to it objectively. The emperor is not wearing any clothes, folks. He is buck naked. So, that's what this, Death at SeaWorld is very key to our efforts, because it is this incredibly engaging, compelling, comprehensive explanation of why he's not wearing any clothes.
And contrary to certain accusations from pro-SeaWorld people, I was not paid by the Humane Society to write this book. I was paid by
Trust me, we don't have the budget for that.
Yeah. I was paid by my wonderful publisher, St. Martin's Press, who I greatly appreciate.
Okay, why don't we take
I
two
know,
more?
Melody, no? Okay.
We'll take one more from...
Do y'all know how many of the beluga whales they plan to actually put in the Georgia Aquarium? Because I know it says that that they're putting them in SeaWorld parks in California, Texas, Florida, various other places.
3 will stay here for sure. That's the current plan. It could change, but 3 will stay here.
My understanding also, Georgia Aquarium owns all of
They
them?
will be the permit holder of record. They will be the owner of record for all 18, but they will loan them out to the other facilities.
It's not
From
allowed.
the start. From the start, they will
They,
loan
they
you.
get a portion of ticket.
Yeah.
So-
There's a contractual agreement.
Yeah. It's kind of
What are the likely consequences for SeaWorld that SeaWorld is facing for ignoring the ruling?
well, we have a government attorney in the room, but I don't think we can ask him. That's an excellent question. What are the consequences for SeaWorld not complying with the judge's ruling? I have written to OSHA. I have written to the Department of Labor. I've written to the Labor Commission. I've written to SeaWorld, and I can't get a straight answer out of anybody. But the answer I'm getting is that SeaWorld is in violation of the judge's ruling right now. So, in theory, OSHA could go there tomorrow and say, why do you have such close contact with your whales when the judge said you're not supposed to do that? Now, SeaWorld, I believe, is asking for more time. They want specifics, I guess, exactly how far away do we have to be from the whales? What constitutes a barrier? I think they want more clarity on that. I think they're just trying to buy time. SeaWorld wants to get its trainers back in the water. There's no secret of that. And they are installing new technologies to try to do that, including a false rising bottom, which was put into G Pool, which is the Dying with Shamu pool. Now that's the pool where 2 people have already died. And they think that they're going to have this bottom that will take 60 seconds to rise up and beach a whale. So let's say on that day with Don Brancher, when he pulled Don in the water, supposedly somebody would have hit a switch, and within 60 seconds, Telecom would have been beached and had Don in his mouth in this false bottom pool. Well, then what? Are you going to go walk up to Telecom and try to get Don out of his mouth? I mean, I don't mean to make a joke out of it. It's serious. But, I mean, I don't think OSHA is going to certify that as providing adequate safety protection.
She did not drown.
Equal to or greater than keeping the trainers out of the water altogether. SeaWorld is filing an appeal in the Federal Court of Appeals District in Washington, D.C. That should be very interesting. I think they want more time, and then they want to try to certify that things like the false bottom and things like spare air, emergency oxygen system are good enough that's safety enough so that trainers can go back into the water. Because let's face it, the show is much better when the trainer's in the water. It just is. It's spectacular.
But both of
They know
those
that.
things address a drowning death, and she did not drown.
That's the problem.
Her spine was broken, her neck was broken, she was dismembered.
And-
So, if he's beached and he's angry, you're still dead.
And the other problem is, for example, in the Ken Peters video, which was released, Kasaka in San Diego several times drags him down to the bottom of the pool. The last time she did that, she has him down there for almost 2 minutes. And he later told Cal OSHA, I wondered whether I was going to see my kids again. So he obviously thought he was going to be down there possibly long enough to die. Well, what if he had a spare air system? He would have had a little, like a frogman gear and a little thing to get oxygen. But then she grabbed him and quickly pulled him up to the surface. Well, if you go scuba diving, you have to very gradually exhale slowly as you make your way to the surface, or your lungs will virtually explode. So unless he timed his exhalation, you're underwater being killed by a whale, and you have to concentrate on breathing slowly as it's bringing you up to the surface. He was 40 feet down below the surface. That's a ton of pressure.
It's not realistic.
So it could be even worse with spare air. And that's why OSHA's, and people ask me this all the time, well, if people want to risk their lives, and what about race car drivers? And maybe John Black and I could have this argument. I personally don't give. I mean, if that's what somebody wants to do to make a living, if they make their $25 an hour, whatever they make doing this, riding on the back of a whale, even though they might get killed, for me personally, I mean, I'm somewhat of a libertarian, have at it. Go. Looks like fun. I wish I could do it. It's the truth. But the U.S. government has a federal mandatory obligation to protect employees. So the government has an interest here. And again, my interest isn't in water work. My interest is in the whales in the first place. And why are they there? So to answer your question, nobody knows.
Can we just go?
That's a long way.
Repeat the question whenever somebody asks.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah.
Whatever they ask.
Oh, okay, great.
So
We
you
will.
can-
What if the permit is issued, this import permit for the belugas? What do you see as the next step? What might happen if that permit is issued?
The question is, what will happen? What's the next step if this import permit for the belugas at the Georgia Aquarium
Really, in
is
the aquarium
issued?
industry.
I'm very concerned that if they actually succeed, not just in getting the permit, which may very well happen, and the whales still wouldn't necessarily come into the country if people rallied around and put enough pressure on them. They could get the permit and not use it, all right? So, but if they actually use it and the whales come into the country, if they succeed at this request, I think the next thing we will see within a couple of years is a request to go into U.S. waters and capture wild cetaceans. They are testing the water with this. That's what I think, and I know they are in fact making inquiries about Alaska. I know that. Orcas, belugas.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
It is not illegal in the United States to capture these animals from the wild. It is an exemption to the take prohibition under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. If you get a permit, you can do it. Nobody's asked for a permit in 20 years because the last time they tried it, which was also in 1993, which was off the coast of California for the Shed Aquarium, it caused such bad publicity that nobody's tried it since. Public pressure works.
Mm-hmm.
Going on that whole premise, what is the atmosphere of the governmental agency around this whole process? Are they leaning towards a certain thing, or do we have an impression of what they're...
A lot of people who are very concerned about these issues have a very sort of angry attitude, or they really are very negative about the government agency responsible, which is the National Marine Fisheries Service of the Department of Commerce. There are plenty of people at NMFS who, you know, I'm all for drop kicking through the goalposts of life. I don't think they're worth, you know, their salt. There are others who really do care, and you have to understand they are only allowed to do what the law allows them to do. If the law says it's legal to import these animals under these conditions, and those conditions are met, they have to issue the permit. They can't hold it back because it's morally wrong or anything like that. So I guess what I'm saying is you can be angry at NMFS if you want to. It's not misplaced anger, but they are not really the problem. Quite frankly, we are. We're buying the tickets.
I personally think it's telling that NMFS is part of the Department of Commerce.
Yes.
So these animals are treated like commodities, really.
They're part of commerce,
They're
you
part
know.
of
They're part of
business.
business. So, but just understand they can only do what the law allows them to do, and they can only prohibit what the law allows them to prohibit. If the laws are weak, that's our fault too, quite frankly. So I'm not saying don't direct your anger at them. There's plenty of wasted space at the National Marine Fisheries Service, but ultimately this isn't their fault. It is the Georgia Aquarium's fault. It is the people who buy the tickets' fault. And I still think if they get the permit, we can stop this. They do not have to use the permit once it's issued.
Can I just getting back to killer whales quickly? I interviewed the Marine Mammal Commission, which doesn't have a lot of power, but they do oversee and advise and things like that. And I asked them about the conditions that these whales live in and everything. And what they told me was, we have 50,000 whales in the wild that we have to worry about keeping alive. There's 42 in captivity, and that was basically their attitude. And they weren't. I mean, that sounds bad, but you can almost see their point. You know that. So I think there might be some government attitude. It's only 40 whales. It's only 16 whales. Compared to what's going on out in the ocean, this is chump change.
And the response to that, by the way, just so you know how to rebut that when you hear it, when you're out there fighting for this, is if you don't think that I don't know how many people are in the United States now, and by the way, some 50 million of them or whatever go to zoos and aquariums, if you don't think they're getting their attitude from going to the Georgia Aquarium, and then if you wonder why they're not concerned about conservation, and if you wonder why they're not voting for more taxpayer dollars going to conservation, you're not thinking right. Again, this is a logic thing. That's where most people learn about these animals, is at the Georgia Aquarium and SeaWorld. They're getting lies, and then they turn around and they vote, and they blow off, turning off the lights and not let the water run, then brush their teeth and driving too much, and all of the things that drive marine conservationists nuts. Okay? So if you wonder why there's apathy or disinterest or lack of interest or misinformation floating around out there in the electorate, 50 million people a year go to zoos and aquariums, and that's where they learn what they know.
And it is a conditioning process, a deliberate conditioning process on the part of the marine parks and the rest of the entertainment captive animal industry. They know exactly what they're doing, and they know exactly what to say from the time little children can hear those words all the way to adulthood. They know exactly what to say and which buttons to push to enact this psychological conditioning process, because that's what it is.
If you,
And that's why they are so afraid of real education, of real information, because they know that that immunizes people against the conditioning that they've subject to every time they turn on the TV or see an ad from SeaWorld or some other place about how wonderful it is to swim with the dolphins and all of this stuff.
If you read the chapter where Don is killed by Tilikum, I described the Dying with Shamu show, and because there's a video of it, so I had it transcribed, or I transcribed it actually, and I was shocked. The narrator, as he was talking, he was kind of ad-libbing. He didn't have a thick script, but there's certain points he's supposed to make in the show, and it is the most ridiculous bull crap you've ever heard in your life. There's nothing educational in it. He says things like, whales love to dance. Oh, whales love to show off their pectoral fins. Oh, look at Shamu go. He loves to catch fish. That's what the guy is saying.
Yeah, there isn't gonna
The only factual thing he said that when the babies are born, they're 7 feet long and 350 pounds. And then he says, ladies, that's like giving birth to Shaquille O'Neal. So that was the big nature lesson in the Dying with Shamu. It's like giving birth to
Cheesy.
Shaquille. It is cheesy. It's kind of gross, but I was shocked. And this was supposed to be the intimate, not splashy, flashy Shamu show. This is supposed to be where you go to actually learn a little bit about the whales and even how they train the whales and things like that. All you got was this sort of this patter that was so juvenile and so have nothing to do with killer whales in the wild. So this is why people leave SeaWorld talking about the Shamu whales. This is why that transient probably thought it was safe to climb in the pool, because he, like lots of people, think they're cute, cuddly, black and white puppy dogs. That's not a very good education.
I was just curious, since education is so important, and David, as you pointed out, you were totally unaware that this existed, and so was I when I read the book. So what are the plans for the NGO organizations who are involved in advocating for these animals to be released and to not be in these captive environments? What are your plans to educate the public, and how can we help?
The question was, what are the plans of the NGO community to sort of move past this impasse of not enough education out there? How do we reach the public? That's the $64,000 question. I think if we drop the ball anywhere in the last 20 years, it's that kind of outreach. You know, we were working on regulations, on legislation, you know, top down, trying to get it regulated or legislated, you know, out of existence. And we made some strides abroad with that. I have to tell you this, the picture is a lot brighter in places like in Europe, in the European Union and that sort of thing. But we dropped the ball on outreach. We dropped the ball on the bottom up, trying to get people to stop buying the tickets. We are starting to work on those things. I mean, Lori has written a really excellent peer-reviewed paper on why the education is crap. We have met with cruise lines, for instance, who are very active in promoting Swim with the Dolphin programs in the Caribbean. We are trying to do more with social media. So, and social media is actually a new tool, not new, but you know, newish tool that we haven't exploited to the full, and we are going to try to do that. In terms of how the public can help, buy the book and make other people buy the book, because that book is everything we've been saying for years in one place. It's a little bit over here and a little bit over there, and I've got this white paper, and I've got two white papers, and you know, I've got, you know, we've got Lori's, you know, peer-reviewed paper, and now it's all in one place. It is readable, it's accessible, it's out there. Please read it because it will convince you. It will convince you. You will have to be SeaWorld drunk the Kool-Aid out of it not to have that book convince
Even
you.
the Wall Street Journal was convinced.
Yeah, and I have to make a pitch here for the fact that there is a giant hole in all of this outreach, and that is academia. Okay, the fact of the matter is that academia is very reluctant to get involved in anything like this. I mean, I could tell you, 10 years of stories about how many colleagues are willing to stick their neck out or not.
About 3.
Yeah, so the academia is where the public goes to get the peer-reviewed papers, the information that comes out that carries substance and weight. And academia has been totally silent on these issues. And it's like an elephant in the room. And the fact of the matter is that has got to change. We have got to be talking about these issues at the universities with the students, having books like this. You know, there is all kinds of talk about human rights of all kinds, rightly so, at the university. As soon as you start to talk about other animals, it becomes taboo. And that has got to change. That has got to change. So being at a university, it's really important to get to the students and to get it mainstreamed into the university, the academic conversation. Very, very important, I think.
We should wind this down.
Yeah, well, I think we need to wind it down because of the book signing.
Yes.
I mean, are there other questions or from tons?
Let's take 3 more.
One suggestion, I just want to get out there real quick. I thought it was a great suggestion from Elise Cleveland. He said, and he comes up with a lot of good ideas.
Hi, Elise.
Yeah. And he said, people want to know what they can do. Buy a copy of the book and donate it to the public library in your.
That's a good idea.
That's a great idea. That happened a lot with evidence of harm.
Yes. So, gosh, it's hard to choose 3 questions.
They've got about 40.
Wow.
More.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, I'll make a really stupid, and I'm really going to regret this, offer.
Oh, no.
I'll take those and I'll answer them.
Wow.
By
How
email.
sweet.
Well, we've been going for an hour and a half, so why don't we go another 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, if everybody's fine with that.
I mean, how many books do we have to sign still?
Who's buying a book?
Do you need it signed, like, you need to go?
No.
Oh, okay. I mean,
Okay,
you need
let's
it
go
signed.
10 more minutes.
Let's
and
go
then
10
we'll
more
sign
minutes.
it.
Thanks, John. Thanks.
Thanks,
Somebody
John.
wants to know if it's possible to stop SeaWorld and others from getting free, fresh genes from animals that have stranded.
Is there a way to stop them from getting these genes? No, probably not. Again, the law allows the import of products for research and public display and enhancement of the species and all of there are exemptions. And so those sorts of permit requests are almost rubber stamped. So it's highly unlikely that we'd be able, we tried the first time they asked and we failed. So we haven't tried again because, once you set the precedent, it's kind of banging your head against a brick wall to keep trying the same thing. That's the definition of insanity, to try the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. However, there may be some other idea that we haven't tried yet, some other avenue. So we're not totally shutting the door and trying to stop that, but doing it at the regulatory level, trying to get the permits stopped, it didn't work.
I'm sure you're probably aware there's a very loud party that's going to be coming to the Georgia Aquarium.
Yes.
Yeah.
Would you like to address the effects of what that's going to do to the cetaceans there?
Cetaceans, dolphins, and whales are very acoustically sensitive animals. And at this, I believe you're talking about the Pride party, right? And there has been a really cogent letter written by the actress Jane Lynch, and a lot of response to that. Because at this party, there have been reports of very, very loud music so that you have to shout over the music, that the animals were agitated. The fact of the matter is, and I'm just going to say this, any group of people who have been abused and exploited themselves should stand up and say, well, we're not going to celebrate and be proud in a place that is all about abuse and exploitation. It's just, so I am really reaching out to the LGBT community and everyone to say, no, we're not going for this. We're going to have to change our venue, and it's just not appropriate. And I am so hoping that that will happen.
I mean, just sort of try to look at it. I always say, try to look at it from the animal's point of view, try to look at it from the whale's point of view. This is their living room. It's the living room that they've been given. And you're going to have a really, really loud frat party in their living room, and they didn't invite you. I mean, it's inappropriate at the very least, and it's harassment at the worst.
I'd also like to say, if you've ever been to the Shamu show, the music is absolutely
unbelievably deafening.
And at night they have a rock and roll.
Every night they have fireworks right over the tank.
And rock and roll. You probably heard
every night.
Tommy Lee wrote to SeaWorld and said, don't play Motley Crue music. And they said, okay, we won't. But the point was that it's extremely loud for these animals. And don't forget, they're coming up out of the water, too. And it must just be very loud for them.
The dolphin show at the Georgia Aquarium is a perfect example of that. I have actually received emails from parents who have said to me, my child was so frightened by that show, I had to take him out. Seriously, because of the violence of the show. So you can imagine what the animals are experiencing that are right in the center of it. It's scaring small children.
These indoor facilities, in particular, the acoustics are often very poor for these animals. Yeah.
Another question?
A lot of reverberation.
No, from the...
Oh, tons, are you kidding? Do you have one that you, go ahead, because I'm gonna sort through these and see which is most important.
Well, I'd like to mention, I'm sorry, because the people watching, or everybody, Naomi and I will be speaking tomorrow night at American University in Washington, D.C., along with Courtney Vail, the Whale and Dolphin Conservation Society. So if you know anybody in the Washington area or anybody online, please encourage them to come.
Encourage them to come. It's at the Wexler Theater at American University. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock.
Okay, well, along that line then, since you said where you're going to be next, there are people who are wanting to know, there's word out there, I guess, that maybe you're coming to Boston. Is that true?
Yes, I'm currently speaking to both the Cetacean Society International for an event in Hartford in early October, followed by an event in Boston with American Cetacean Society. Naomi and I will also be at Barnes & Noble in downtown Orlando on October 23rd.
I hope that's as entertaining as it sounds.
Yeah, it sounds fun. And we're also speaking at the American Cetacean Society meeting in November in San Diego, in Mission Bay, right next to SeaWorld.
Yeah.
I'm also speaking October 10th in Philadelphia. There's a screening of the movie A Fall from Freedom, and then I'll be speaking after that. So we got a lot of interest, a lot of events coming up.
One other thing on that same subject is they're asking, are you going to Canada?
Am I going to Canada? I would love to go to Canada. A third of this book takes place in Canada. I find Canadians are extremely interested in this topic, particularly with what's going on in Marineland. I was interviewed for the show called Q. I don't know if you get it here in Atlanta. It's out of Montreal, but it's on Public Radio International, so it aired in New York and Chicago and DC. Huge show. And the book sales in Canada just went through the roof after that interview, so I knew there was a great response there. So I need to talk to my publisher to see who's going to pay for a trip to Canada, but I think it would be a fabulous thing to do.
Toronto would be the place.
Yeah.
Toronto would be the place, yeah.
Has this inspired you to look at maybe doing stories on other captive animals, like
Oh, yes.
circuses?
The question is, has this inspired me about other captive animals? It certainly has, to read about them and possibly to write about them. Probably not another book about them. I've now done 2 animal books I'm not an animal rights person at all. People ask me, well, I was very specific and focused on killer whales. Well, what about dolphins? What about belugas? What about... And the more I learn, the more I realize if I were to study that to the extent that I study, I would probably come to the same conclusion, but I'd rather not go out on that limb because I can't back myself up with the same statistics. But, and especially talking to Lori about self-recognition and memory and mourning, and I'm reading a book that's going to be coming out by Dr. Barbara King. She blogs for NPR, and she's wrote a book about how animals grieve and mourn, and she talks about whales and dolphins. So when I think about those criteria, I think of elephants, and I think of great apes, and I think cetaceans, great apes, and elephants probably should not be in captivity, period. And then I think we really do need to consider it species by species, because I'm not across the board anti-captivity. Poor Lynn, after reading my book, felt guilty about her fish aquarium at home. And I wonder how much fish mourn the ocean. I don't know. Maybe they do, But higher, and I know I'm going to be called a speciesist and everything else, but those three sets of animals, I think you probably...
It's not a question of higher or lower. It's a question of the nature of the animal. And the nature of large, highly intelligent, self-aware, social mammals makes them incompatible with captivity.
Just like humans.
And I've been involved with the elephant captivity issue and to some extent the great ape issue as well. The issues are the same across the board because they're all the same on those relevant characteristics. So elephants and great apes suffer just as much as cetaceans, dolphins and whales do in zoos, in circuses, in laboratories, in captivity.
I think one more question, because then we've got 15 minutes for book signing.
Okay, how did we pick one?
But I'm very serious about taking this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to write down the ones that you don't get to so that you can address them.
The idea that the Georgia Aquarium is pulling in 18 belugas from the Russian organization there that inhumanely captured these animals, obviously. Does that not violate the law here in the sense that maybe Georgia Aquarium doesn't physically do that, but the capture mechanism of
No, it would. It would absolutely violate the law, regardless of who did it, if it was ruled to be inhumane. Unfortunately, the National Marine Fisheries Service has concluded that the capture methods used in Russia are humane. And we can go to court on this, and I'm going to be working with our lawyers to see if we have a case, but I'm making no promises because it's a tricky question under the law, not under your ethics or your emotions, or even the facts of how these animals are thrashing around and clearly are not having a great time. But under the law, it's a very squishy definition, and a lot of discretion is given to the agency, and that's what they have concluded. It would be a he said, she said kind of case in the courts, and those are very bad, usually, for the plaintiff.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.